Before the world ever spoke the word Africa, before empires rose and fell, before the Roman soldiers marched across the north, and before European maps carved borders that divided nations, this vast land already had a name born from its own soil, its own people, its own spirit. That name was Alkebulan, a name whispered by ancient tongues, spoken around fires, carved into memory, carried through migrations, and guarded by elders. A name meaning. Long before the world came to know this continent as Africa, its people knew it by the names they themselves created, names rooted in identity, ancestry, and belonging. But to understand how Africa came to be called Africa, we must journey far back, beyond colonial narratives, beyond Roman texts, beyond what foreign historians claimed. We must return to the time when Africans named themselves. Africa is the oldest inhabited continent on Earth. Every river, desert, forest, and mountain carries stories older than recorded history. Civilizations rose on this soil long before the world built pyramids, temples, or cities. The first humans, our ancestors, walked here. The first languages formed here. The first ideas of community, family, and wisdom were born on this land. So naturally, the first names for the land also came from those early communities. Unlike later European naming, which often came from conquest, African names were born from meaning. Names like Ethiopia, land of burnt faces, symbolic of black pride. Kemet, the black land, describing fertile soil and the people. Aethiops, in early Greek references, land of the black people. Ta-Seti, beloved land, used by ancient Egyptians. These names reveal a truth. Alkebulan, the name that carried the continent. The name Alkebulan is perhaps the oldest and most widely referenced indigenous name for the continent. It survived through ancient Kemetic, Egyptian, languages, Libya and Tunisia's Berber tongues, pre-Arabic East African dialects, West African oral traditions. Alkebulan may have evolved from older combinations. Kebulan, meaning land, birthplace, or nourishing mother. Together, Alkebulan meant the mother continent. This name reflects an African worldview, the belief that land is not just geography, it is identity, ancestry, and divine origin. Afri, the first people to give the continent its modern root. Long before Roman maps, a powerful indigenous group lived in what is now Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. They were known as the Afri. These were African people, Berbers, Amazigh, and pre-Amazigh tribes. They lived in powerful city-states, trading with ancient Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Nubians. The word Afri in their language meant people of the land. Cave dwellers, from Ifri meaning cave. People of the sun. Community or tribe. These meanings reflect identity, not race or ethnicity. When foreign traders asked the name of this region, they were told, the land of the Afri. From this indigenous African name would later emerge variations like, but the root, the oldest form, was Afri, named by Africans themselves. It is important to understand that Africa is vast, home to thousands of ethnic groups, languages, and cultures. Different communities had different names for the land depending on where they lived. In East Africa, the land was called. In Central Africa. In West Africa, Oduduwa's land. Guinea, meaning black or dark. Congo land. These names weren't random. They reflected ownership, identity, and ancestral connection. When foreigners, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, reached Africa, they did not arrive at a nameless continent. They found Africa had already named itself thousands of years earlier. Foreigners simply adapted or mispronounced the names they encountered. The indigenous Afri people, for example, became Afri Afer Ifri Afrikia Africa. But we must remember, the original name did not come from Rome. It did not come from Europe. It did not come from outsiders. The roots of the name Africa began with Africans. For ancient Africans, identity was not continental, it was cultural. People identified themselves by you were a Nubian, a Kushite, a Somali, a Berber, a Yoruba, a Congo, a Zulu, a Tigray, a Fulani, Arakan. The idea of a single name for the entire continent came much later, as communication and trade networks expanded. But even then, the names people used, Afri, Ifri, Alkebulan, were African. When we speak of how Africa was named, we must begin with this truth. Africa named itself long before outsiders arrived. It named itself through indigenous tribes, sacred languages, ancient identities, a cultural memory, oral tradition, a spiritual meaning. The name Africa is not foreign. Its roots were born from the soil itself, shaped by the people who lived here since the beginning of humanity. Africa's name is African. Its meaning is African. Its origin is African. Its soul is African. Before the world learned to whisper the word Africa, long before maps had borders or oceans had names, the continent carried a far older identity, a name whispered across savanna winds, etched into desert stones, and carried in the tongues of ancient people who understood their place in creation. That name was Alkebulan, a name powerful enough to center identity, a name ancient enough to precede empire, a name sacred enough to carry the memory of humanity's first footsteps. Alkebulan, the mother of mankind, the Garden of Eden, the land of the original people. This was not a title given by foreigners. This was not a label imposed by geography. This was a name spoken by Africa herself. It is in Alkebulan that our story truly begins. When early African communities began to form language, they did not see themselves as tribes trapped within borders. They saw themselves as children of a vast womb, a land whose rivers fed life and whose skies shaped destiny. They believed the continent was not a place, but a living presence. To the ancient Saharan ancestors, the land was a spirit, a giver of food, water, shelter, and knowledge. To the Nile Valley, the land was a mother goddess whose rhythms dictated time. To the Bantu peoples, the earth was an origin, the source from which all families emerged. So when they looked at their home, they did not call it by the name of a single tribe. They called it by its essence. Alkebulan, the land of life. It was a name that carried the meaning of identity, belonging, and creation. A name that declared, here is where humanity began. This is why so many African oral traditions, from Ghana to Ethiopia, from Sudan to the Great Lakes, all claim that the first people walked on African soil. Because to them, the continent was not simply a landmass. It was the origin point of all living things, the meaning behind the name. In ancient African linguistics, the root Bulan or Bulan, U, is found in several early Afroasiatic and Proto-Bantu languages, all carrying meanings connected to life, nature, or creation. African linguists and oral historians have interpreted Alkebulan as the womb of nations, the cradle or birthplace, the land of the first people, the source of life. African civilizations were fully aware of their antiquity. They knew that humanity came from the valleys, lakes, forests, and mountains they walked upon daily. They understood migration long before the world discovered anthropology. So they named their continent in a way that reflected that ancient truth. Alkebulan was not a direction on a map. It was an identity. Unlike Roman records or Greek chronicles, the name Alkebulan survived not through parchment but through memory, the memory of African elders, griots, and spiritual leaders who preserved it across centuries. You can still hear echoes of the name today in Amazigh, Berber, oral traditions, early Ethiopian chronicles, old Sudanese folk histories, Hausa Fulani spiritual stories, pre-Islamic North African inscriptions, Cushitic and Nilotic linguistic structures, ancient Kemet's southern texts referring to lands beyond the Nile. Even though the name was not written by a conquering empire, it lived in the hearts and tongues of millions. This is why historians say, Africa did not need Europe to name her. She named herself. When Arabs and later Europeans entered the continent, they brought new names, not to honor African identity, but to replace it. Arab historians used terms like Afriqiya, Maghreb, Bilad as Sudan, land of the blacks. Europeans later adapted the Roman word Africa, applying it to the entire continent, even though Rome only controlled a tiny portion of North Africa. This means that the name Africa, as used today, is not indigenous. It was imposed during foreign control. It replaced older African expressions of self-identity. But while foreign empires replaced the name on maps, they could not fully erase the truth in African memory. The continent still remembers that it once had a name meaning mother, not colony, a name meaning origin, not ownership, a name meaning identity, not geography. Alkebulan. Modern science now confirms what African ancestors always knew. Africa is humanity's birthplace. The earliest Homo sapiens fossils were found in East Africa. The most ancient human DNA is traced to southern and western Africa. Archaeological sites across Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa reveal the world's first tools, art, and social structures. But African ancestors did not need laboratories to understand this. They lived these truths. They looked at the soil that fed them, the rivers that guided them, the seasons that shaped them, and understood that they were connected to something far older than any one clan or nation. That is why the name Alkebulan is so powerful. It is not simply historical. It is spiritual. It is existential. It declares, this is the land where life began, where humanity took its first breath. Before Africa became a word in foreign tongues, before it became a territory on colonial maps, before the world knew its shape or size, it was Alkebulan, a mother, a home, an identity, a cradle. To remember this name is to reclaim a piece of African memory long buried beneath centuries of conquest and renaming. It reminds us that Africa's story began not with colonization, but with creation. It reminds us that Africa was not discovered, because she existed before the discoverers. It reminds us that Africa's identity was not given by others. It came from within. And that is why, when we speak of how the continent was named, we must begin not with Rome, not with the Greeks, not with the Arabs, but with the people who first walked the earth, and named their home Alkebulan, the mother of mankind. To be continued in next post.